Hello, welcome. We're here to talk about the movie trend analysis for Profectus Entertainment. This is Daniel Harris. Let's go ahead and get started. Um, so, all that I'm here to show you today is on the slide deck. The slide deck is on the website that is listed here. You can pull this information, the slide deck, and this recording directly from that website. So, um, let's talk a little bit about what we're here. Um, Clearly, you guys are a movie production company. As we've discussed, you said that really what you're interested in is your startup. You're really interested in making good use of your initial funds. Try and invest in very stable projects early on so that you can build up a kind of a catalog of successes and also build up some revenue so that you can invest in more risky projects. So all that makes sense. Specifically, um, what we were talking about is that you guys are in the early stages of your business model development. You're interested in the trends for the last 20 plus years. Um, you're also interested in how COVID may have impacted that. Maybe there's something in there that you might be able to take advantage of that maybe could give you a leg up. Um, so you're looking at resilience and specifically about safe genres. So what's going to be a safer investment? What's going to be more of a risky investment? So let's take a look. So what we've done is we've pulled this data from Kaggle.com, specifically the box office revenue data set. This data set has worldwide revenue of the top 200 movies every year from 2020 to 2024. It's primarily revenue data, genre, release, popularity information. It does not include any budgeting information or any details about streaming services or delivery methods. Um, so, because this is an analysis specifically on genres, that really shouldn't be an issue. Now, we did have to do a few things to clean up this data in order to make it really work for our analysis. The details of that are in the appendices of this slide deck, so you can always look at that whenever you wish. But primarily, the big things that we did is we filtered out some of the things that really are going to kind of skew it. So one of the major things we did is we skewed out we filtered out blockbusters. So blockbusters, if you look at the data, they significantly change kind of the revenue. So what we are looking at is, since we're trying to see big trends within the genres, we're trying to ignore the big blockbuster things. And that's significant because there are some blockbusters that make exponentially more money than other genres. So if we're trying to look at genre trends, those having those blockbusters in there really kind of skews the data. Additionally, we've cleaned out anything that is missing data or some of the things that can cause errors within the analysis. Another thing is that in this data set, there were re-release movies, so we're only counting the first release. So let's get into the approach. So the approach that we're taking here is, because this is a very broad look at revenue trends, we're going to treat this as an exploratory analysis. So we'll have an opportunity later in future analysis to do much deeper dives, but right now we're looking at the broad scope of genres. So in order to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the five factors within this data set that might really help us understand stability. Now, the the problem statement said we're looking for um, safer genres. Well, we're going to, from a statistical term, we're going to interpret that as stable. Okay, and what that means for us is that stable is going to be, it's going to have minimal fluctuation. There's going to be some evidence of trends. There's not going to be a whole lot of variation. It's going to be pretty clear. Neutral is something that there may be moderate fluctuations, and there may not be, you know, evidence of significant trends. Unstable is going to be more of the, this has significant fluctuation or has a lack of data or has some significant problem with it. So those are the factors we're going to use to try and identify what's stable, right? What's safe. So the five things we're going to look at is genre representation. So how much has the genre been represented in the last 24 years? Annual revenue consistency, which is, how well, does the genre seem to do? Does it seem to produce, pretty even revenue, or is it up and down? A revenue distribution. So is that revenue caused by a few movies, or is it caused by you know a lot of movies over time? So that distribution is going to tell us something. Also, popularity consistency. So we're also looking at how popular do those genres tend to be. So does that have any significance for us? And then the last thing we're looking at is, of course, COVID resilience. How did it react to COVID? Does that tell us anything? So let's go ahead and jump in. So the first thing is genre representation. So evaluate what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate the presence and consistency of the genres, and we're going to look at how strongly and consistently the genres represent the top 200. So to do that, we're looking at a heat map. So this heat map tells us some very interesting things right away. First of all, we can see that we have a pre-COVID and a post-COVID era. So we see that line right there between 2019 and 2020. So that kind of helps us see some things. Now, a few things pop out right away. Drama, comedy, action, the percentages of those movies in each year is very high, as identified by the dark heat map. Um, Also, of additional interest, you can see that westerns, war, music, history, those things have a lot of gaps where there isn't representation everywhere. That actually has impact on other things within our analysis. So, very interesting things there. Also, what we see is that there were some changes after COVID. You can see that there was a little bit more growth. Horror seemed to, strangely enough, become a little bit more popular or more consistently represented post COVID. Also, animation. Now, that may that be because it was easier to produce animation during COVID years, whereas anything that required people to be on site was difficult to do. So, very interesting trend, but that bears out what you would maybe expect. So, what we took away from that is that the genres that are highly represented are drama, comedy, action. The ones with low representation, Western, history, mystery, music, war, documentary. Everything else is moderately um, reflected. So we're going to interpret that as stable is the high represented, um, moderate is the neutral ones, and low representation is unstable. All right, so let's keep going. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the annual revenue consistency. So, again, for each genre, how significantly does the revenue fluctuate across the years? All right. So, if there's, you know, it's very popular you know, in the early 2000s, but it's not very popular later. That's something that's interesting to us. So, the way that we looked at this is we used the, um, the regression line, and we took a look at it. And there's some very interesting things here. We see that um, action is generally stable, adventure is generally unstable. There is a downward trend. However, what we're also looking at is that a significant trend, or is that something that could be explained by a random chance? Now, throughout this data set, we find that there was nothing that was a significant, statistically significant. So these results could be by random chance. So while we may see a downward trend or a slight upward trend, it's very possible that this was caused by a random chance. So this might be an opportunity for future analysis later. So real quickly, we'll just kind of jump through these, but we see there is a slightly downward trend with comedy as well, but it's approaching significance, but it's not really there yet. The others of these have almost no statistic significance. The other thing that's interesting is not only do we see that trend, but that green bar is how wide is that bar, so it helps us see how much variation there is. So in this case, where there's a tighter bar, that actually tells us that there's less variation and it's probably more stable. So as we go through this, keep going. So what we did is also, because there's so many genres, we broke them up into kind of their big categories. So that's why we have emotionally driven genres and sci-fi and speculative fiction or speculative. So so now here we're seeing some more things. We don't, again, they're not any real statistically significant. We do see with fantasy there seems to be a downward trend. It's approaching significance, but it's not there. Um, Science fiction does seem to have a slight upward trend, but that's not statistically significant, as we see by that p-value. That tells us whether or not that's really a significant thing, or whether it's something that's caused by um, potentially chain by random chance. All right. So next, we have some other things. So interesting thing here with the niche and artistic genres is that because those are through our previous slide, we were seeing that they were low represented. There's not a lot of information on some of these, so which is why we see specifically with Western, there's kind of this big flat line that doesn't have a lot of variation to it. So there's not a lot of data there. So it's interesting here that there are little pockets of variation, but generally these are relatively uh, unstable. There's just not a lot of data there. Now, the interesting thing there with suspense and horror is that those horror looks relatively stable, seems to be pretty consistent trend line, and then thriller seems like um, it it also is approaching statistical significance, and there is a downward trend. But again, same issue. That is not a statistically significant downward trend. So, so we're not sure that that is uh, based off of predictable factors. This one would definitely be worth further investigation to determine, hey, are thrillers specifically being impacted? Is there a consistent downward trend? And then we could look into deeper factors for that. Next, we're going to look at the revenue consistency. Oh, I'm sorry. Uh, this was the results of that. So we can see very quickly, unstable genres, adventure, thriller, war. Stable genres are action, animation, science fiction, family, crime, horror, romance, western, history, mystery. So okay, so let's keep going. There's a lot to cover. So next thing we're looking at is the revenue in the genre driven by many movies? So there's a wide number of movies that are contributing to that consistency, or is it relatively unstable? Meaning there's there seems to be a long string of you know, uh, movies that are in the outliers that may be kind of driving the revenue more because they're higher higher revenue compared to lower revenue. So what we're looking at here is we're doing the same thing, but now we're looking at violin plots. So what we're kind of looking for here is we're looking for these instances where if that violin plot is relatively thin and there seems to be kind of a big wide um, it seems to be pretty tall like adventure here, then that suggests that more movies are contributing the um, to the revenue. Whereas when you see something where um, there's a little bulb down at the bottom, and then there's this very large um, kind of tail to it, that suggests that the revenue is being driven by those outliers. There's a lot of movies that are kind of clustered around, but then there's these outliers that are really kind of helping drive that. So that's suggesting that those are are not balanced. So what we're seeing here clearly, as I already mentioned, adventure. Adventure is relatively stable. Um, Action kind of it's starting to look a little bit stable, but there's still some concerns there. As we look through this, we can see that comedy is pretty unstable. Family is it looks like it has some stability to it, but it's still got a bit of a tail to it. Um, Moving on, if we're looking at these, we can see over on the left the emotionally driven genres. They seem to be unstable and neutral. But over with fantasy and science fiction, there seems to be kind of this broad um, distribution of the revenue. Again, suggesting that the revenue is being brought in by a large number of movies instead of very specific sets of movies. Still going, we kind of see the same trends over there on the left. We do see that war seems to have some war movies seem to have some stability, but and horror and thrillers also very interesting. Thriller is a very interesting one because there is a little bit of variation there in the distribution, but there's also a very long tail. So that suggests that it doesn't completely fit neither the unstable or the stable categories. So that's why it falls kind of in the middle. So overall, what we're looking at here is that um, stable. We have adventure, sci-fi, fantasy, war movies. Again, war is kind of interesting because it's, as we saw earlier, it's low represented. Uh, so let's keep going. So now popularity and consistency. So popularity, what we're looking at is, in this, we're looking for kind of not a lot of variation in this, and we're looking for values that are in the in the higher ranges. So this is vote counts is based off of how popular is a movie based off of how many people are actually voting for it. So this isn't a measure of quality, but this is how often are people actually voting for it? How are people engaged with it? So what we're looking for is we're looking for things that are relatively flat. We're not looking for a lot of variation. If we see, four or five spikes. That's definitely that's okay. Especially when we see one or two spikes, that's still there's some stability. But we're looking for some consistency, and we're also looking for that value to be relatively high. So in that 1,000 votes or more. So with this, this is interesting trying to see all of them together. Um, on this, there are a couple of very interesting things. One's comedy. It's very kind of stable, not a whole lot of trends, and then there's a drop right around the COVID time. Very interesting. You see that in a couple places. You also see a little bit of that in adventure. Adventures, we're going, oh, hey, there's a lot of fluctuation, but there is kind of they're up above that 1,000 votes consistently, but then there's a drop. Animation was even though there's some spikes there, there's still, um, it's still uh, seeing several votes. But then even before COVID, there was kind of a drop where it's like, okay, we're voting for, you know, they're not as popular, but they still have some popularity. So again, this kind of helps us see this. Another one that's very interesting here is westerns. Westerns, um, those big flat lines actually kind of indicate that there was nothing happening there. Usually, you'd see some variation there. That's not happening. So again, westerns are low. So overall, we're seeing some popularity um, trends here. Um, so stable drama, action, animation, family, crime, mysteries, comedies. Those are relatively stable from a popularity standpoint. Um, but here again, if you're interested, you can come take a closer look at this and see these details. Now, the last one we're going to look at is COVID resilience. So this was something that was definitely in the problem statement. There's some interest, and how what we're looking here is how did the genres react to COVID-19? Well, to look at that, what we did is we kind of took this graph and we decided to look at the percentage of change between the post-COVID and pre-COVID periods. So, what was you know, the average number of movies pre-COVID versus post-COVID, and how big of a difference was that? Well, what we found is that overall, when we're looking at uh, revenue, the far left there, we're seeing that overall most of the genres actually did have a significant difference in revenue pre-COVID versus post-COVID. Only four of the genres really kind of seem to be in a reasonable range. Now, for the purposes of this analysis, that range was determined at about 20% off of average. Now, um, if we take the next step over and we look at the middle graph and we look at popularity, we see that interestingly enough, family movies definitely had um, a spike in popularity. Animation was in that neutral range, and everything else was less than 20, had a 20% or more difference. Most significantly being westerns and documentaries, where it's just like they just dropped off. Now, the other thing we did for this one is we kind of combine those things to see what does that tell us together. And you can kind of look at this as quadrants, and you can see in the upper right, you see family and animation. On the lower right, you see um, science fiction and mysteries, but everything else is in that lower left quadrant, indicating that when we look at those two things together, those are really the less stable. We're actually seeing a lot more variation from COVID. So those all those items in red are generally not very resilient. Did not prove to be very resilient with COVID. So all of this, what does all of this tell us? So, oh well, jumped the gun here a little bit. There was one other thing we looked at. So the previous slides did kind of suggest, well, what is that difference? Now this is more of a curiosity. It didn't really work into the analysis, but what were those big changes? So this is very interesting because it shows you that animation and comedy both had significant changes in the average number of movies that were showing up pre-COVID versus post-COVID. Animation saw a significant increase, you know, near over over 15, 17, 18 more average movies post-COVID, but comedy saw about 16 or 17 fewer movies post-COVID. So very interesting things there. Didn't really influence the stability measure, but it does, as comedy was already pretty low. So this is a very interesting thing. So what does that tell us? So all of those results kind of bring those together, and we see some very interesting things. And overall, family movies seem to have the most stability. They're moderately well represented in the top 200. The revenue doesn't seem to fluctuate. It seems to be pretty stable. The distribution of what movies are producing it, now that's in the neutral range. But the popularity is also stable, and it seemed to be pretty COVID resilient. So from this analysis, the analysis suggests that family movies are a very safe bet. Now, action and animation are also very safe, but action is interesting because that's probably worth additional investigation, as it's it's unstable post COVID. So again, was that because it was very hard to film those during COVID and it hasn't rebounded yet? That would be worth additional investigation. So the low represented movies, with the exception of mystery, are showing that generally those are not going to be your safer bets. So there are some opportunities here, though. So with this, while family definitely comes out as our winner, and probably your safest bet, there are some you can definitely take this and do some further investigation. So what are some things that we could do? Now, understand while this analysis does represent initial analysis and highlights general trends, um, it's a very high level analysis. It's very wide, so you would have some opportunities to really kind of look into some very specific things. You may consider applying a weighting structure to that our results chart. Maybe we're going to find that it's most important that uh, the annual revenue stability is the heaviest thing. Now we could also do an analysis to say which of these factors maybe have the greatest impact, and we could do statistical analysis of that as well. Um, some other things we could do is you could consider a deeper study that includes more information that might uh, drive genre information, budget data, specific release dates, theater lifespans. Um, you could also look at delivery methods, or Are they being streaming? Is it theaters? Is it rentals? Are we selling the discs? Um, Again, another opportunity is you might focus in on a single factor and do a more stringent approach to it. Maybe tighten up the scoring method. There are some ways we could definitely look at that. Also, we could look at a specific genre and say, hey, do we really want to invest in family and do a much deeper analysis of that? Could do some aggressive model testing on that to say, okay, what happens if we change these factors? Um, there were some other things that we found in the data. There's uh, those near significant revenue stability. Those might be emerging trends. There's an opportunity to look at those as well. Um, the specific timelines of COVID, we looked at a pre-COVID and post-COVID. Well, we could actually break that into a pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID, and see if there's any rebounding that's happening. The difference between during COVID and post COVID. But we didn't have those dates for this analysis, so didn't apply that here. Um, Also, we're still recovering from COVID, so we're not really sure, if we've seen enough data to help us identify whether it's rebounding. And then we're going to perform a closer inspection of um, the revenue distribution to look at those low genres and find out if those are really statistically significant. So, um, I really thank you for your time. I hope that you enjoyed this. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can always reach me at this email.